on that regard. And going to share, I think nobody here is new to this, so I think I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can dive in. In looking for what to look at today and what to learn today, there's lots of choices because the Zohar spent a lot of time on Exodus. I was thinking in terms of Pesach-related stuff, we try and find something from Bishalach, where we start talking a little bit more about how the Zohar understands the moment of the Exodus, and then perhaps more importantly, the moment of receiving the Torah in Parashat Yitro, which now is a while behind us in the weekly Torah reading cycle, but because it's Pesach, seems more present than ever. And there's this passage here that I thought we might look at today, which begins with Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Elazar traveling, as they often are. Rabbis on the road could be the subtitle of the Zohar, because so often it's the adventures of them traveling that leads to the teachings that they then discover and reveal. And that's true in this case as well. Hello, Jason. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Clean shaven again? Yeah. So it's a bit of a confusing one because it's the Zohar, so that's a given at this point. But they're going to explore a midrashic idea about what exactly happened to Moses when he went up onto Mount Sinai, which I think is really interesting and has some different implications for how we understand the Torah and its significance. So I think we'll leave it there and dive in. Does anyone want to start reading from Rabbi Chia was traveling to visit Rabbi Elazar? Any keen readers?
I can read.
Yeah, please, David.
Rabbi Chia was traveling to visit Rabbi Eliezer. He found him sitting next to the Rabbi Shimon, son of Rabbi Yosem of Lekonia, his father-in-law. As he raised his head, he saw Rabbi Chia said, "In that day Israel will be the third with Egypt and with Assyria, a blessing on the earth. With Hashem of the hosts we bless, saying, Blessed be my people Egypt, my handiwork Assyria, and my heritage Israel." Isaiah.
Okay. So thank you, David. So we have this rather typical opening in which you have several rabbis interacting with each other. It doesn't really matter who they all are and their personalities because it's not that relevant, although you do see it over time, how each of them has their own approach to things. But Rabbi Chia is going to see Rabbi Elazar. He finds him, and he's there with a third person, who's Rabbi Shimon, not the usual Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's the protagonist, but they want to stress a different Rabbi Shimon, son of Rabbi Yossi, who's the son of Laconia, who presumably is Elazar's father-in-law, some kind of family member. So there's three of them sitting there. And as he raised his head, presumably this is Shimon or Elazar, doesn't know, and sees Rabbi Chia coming, he quotes this verse from Isaiah. This is a really weird verse, right? What would you say this verse means? In that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on earth, whom God will bless. What's the implication of that?
Third great nation?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. So there's a sense here in Isaiah's prophecy that someday Israel will be just like Egypt and Assyria. Now, to Isaiah, Egypt and Assyria are the two great nations of the world. They don't know about much more beyond that. And in the Mediterranean, it was indeed the case that Egypt and Assyria, later Egypt and Babylon, were the major superpowers. Everyone else, including Israel, often got caught in between them. So this prophecy is about this future time in which all three have equal status, Israel included. And you have a wonderfully fascinating moment where Isaiah quotes God saying, "Blessed be my people, Egypt," right? Not something we expect to see. That God is equally as preferential to Egypt and Assyria, who he calls my handiwork, as to my heritage, Israel. David, you got a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering what is the sense of this prophecy as to oppressor powers and then with the redeemed one to be equal. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, so Egypt and Assyria are extremely powerful nations, but also very violent ones, and ones associated with a lot of upheaval, violence, invasion, conquest. Not usually how we think about Israel in that context. We think about Israel as being the one squeezed between Egypt and Assyria. So Isaiah's prophecy about someday it'll be the third of these great empires seems like a really unusual and strange one. Why does Rabbi Shimon or Rabbi Elazar, we don't know who, quote this verse when he sees Rabbi Chia coming? We don't really get to find out, I'm afraid, because he gives a little bit more explanation. He says, "How foolish are the inhabitants of the world who do not know or consider the words of Torah. For words of Torah, ... And then the manuscripts are all missing. So universally, it's a bit confusing as to what exactly was meant to be here. And there's a variety of explanations. If you go to the footnote, it tells you more about, oh, well, this manuscript has this, but we think that's probably a later scribe filling something in. This one has that. It seems like whatever the teaching part of this was lost. Danny Matt suggests that actually he thinks it's probably just a joke, that Rabbi Shimon is making a joke because they're already himself and Rabbi Elazar sitting there, and Rabbi Hia comes, and so he's making a joke about, oh, it's the third great nation. If it is a joke, it doesn't seem terribly funny to us, but the humor of 2,000 years ago would probably be lost on us anyway. So whatever it is, we don't really get to see what's explained. I would love to, because it's a fascinating verse, and the idea that God calls Egypt my people is such a rich moment to explore, especially around Pesach. But alas, we are missing whatever happens next. And instead, by the time we get the thread of the conversation, Rabbi Hia is speaking, and he's quoting a different verse. So David, do you want to continue a bit more on from there, Rabbi Hia?
Yeah. Sorry, wait. Oh, how foolish are the inhabitants of the world? Why do not know and consider the word of Torah? For the word of Torah, Rabbi Hia said to him, I saw, look, at first it is written, her ways are ways of delightfulness in Proverbs. He replied, ways of Noam, delightful. Surely, what are the ways of delightfulness? It is written to gaze upon Noam, the beauty of Hashem. And they have already established what is meant by the beauty of Hashem. Therefore, Torah and her ways issue from the beauty, those who branching within it. Hence, all their paths are peace.
Okay, pause it there. So Proverbs 3:17, it's a great verse. Anyone know it? We get two snippets of it here.
Yeah, we sing all the time as Chaim. Is that one?
Yeah, it's part of it. Darachecha darchei noam, v'chol netivotecha shalom. Right? So this is the part they're quoting. Darachecha darchei noam, all of her ways are ways of delightfulness. Noam, or pleasantness or pleasure. V'chol netivotecha shalom, and all of her paths are paths of peace. So what is that talking about in Proverbs? Anyone know? Why is it feminine when it says all of her ways are ways of pleasantness and all of her paths are paths of peace? Who's the her?
The Torah.
Sort of.
The female part of God.
Actually, it's the wisdom, I
Female
think.
part of God.
Yeah, so the Torah and the female part of God all come later, but David, you're right. For the book of Proverbs, it's talking about the Greek idea of Sophia, meaning a personified wisdom. It works in both Hebrew and in Greek that the word for wisdom is a feminine word. In Hebrew, it's chokhmah, in Greek, Sophia. And as a result, there is similar traditions in both cultures around talking about wisdom as a personified thing, almost like a deity, right? That wisdom itself is discussed. And large parts of Proverbs, ostensibly, are talking about wisdom is in a third person as the feminine being, including the famous passage from Proverbs 31, which is Eshet Chayil, right, is also in many ways talking about this feminine notion of wisdom. Now, it's not a big jump for the rabbis to take that and go, oh, by the way, that's also Torah. When we say wisdom, we mean Torah. That actually doesn't seem like much of a stretch, nor is it a huge stretch, maybe less so to us who have spent time with the Zohar, for the later Kabbalists to go, actually, it's not just Chokhmah, nor is it just Torah, it's actually this whole personified female aspect of God, which we call Shekhinah. That's what we expect to see, as you pointed out, Jenna, especially reading the Zohar, is this immediate jump to talking about God in more or less polytheistic language. So let's look at it as a result in that idea, because that's what the Zohar has in mind, right? All of her ways are ways of pleasantness, Noam. They want to know what that means. What is Noam, right? We don't mean the youth group, by the way, although this is where that name comes from, and they have that verse, by the way, on their T-shirts, which is a wonderfully Kabbalistic meaning, although I'm not sure most of the kids that go to Noam camp appreciate that. So this idea is, what does Noam mean? They connect it to another verse from Psalms, to gaze upon Noam, the beauty of Adonai, the beauty of Hashem. So beauty here is Tiferet, which of course, for those who spent time with the Sfirot, trigger some acknowledgement of the fact that they're connecting her ways are ways of Noam. Noam is actually code for Tiferet. Tiferet, of course, is the masculine when Shekhinah is the feminine. Oversimplified for sure, but beauty is the key word that links to the idea of Tiferet, which means beauty or harmony, and is the attribute of the male being in the divine imagery. So we have a sense that when we're talking about all of her ways are ways of pleasantness, what we're really saying is all of her ways are ways to Tiferet. This is very similar to what we've seen before, where we looked at another passage from Beshalach about the Exodus, and about it talking about the Shekhinah as being the gate to Tiferet and the gate to all the other Sfirot, so that through her is how you get to everyone else. So when it says all of her ways are ways to Tiferet, that's not surprising. And they link it to the latter half of the verse, all of her paths are paths of peace, right? And they make a connection with the word shalom, which also is often used as a keyword for Tiferet, the masculine. Interestingly, that the masculine has these very soft words, peace, beauty, harmony. Those are the words that are connected to the masculine persona of God. There's lots of interesting papers to be written about how gender is constructed by these texts, but it's not at all what you'd expect in the Western sense. Okay, so it doesn't really matter. We just need to buy into the idea that beauty here is a keyword for Tiferet, and when we're talking about the Shekhinah, we talk about her paths, and they're going to try and explore that a bit more by connecting it more to verses from Song of Songs, which of course is the book we read at Pesach, and a familiar quote for the Zohar. Someone else want to pick up from where Rabbi Chia continues? Thank you to David for reading before.
I'll do it.
Thank you, Janice.
Rabbi Hayer said, "We have learned when the Blessed Holy One gave the Torah to Israel, a light of that beauty radiated, crowning the Blessed Holy One. From that beauty sparkled lustres of all worlds, all heavens. Of that moment is written, O daughters of Zion, come out and gaze upon King Solomon, upon the crown with which his mother crowned him on the day of his wedding, on the day of his heart's delight." Song of Songs. At the time when the temple was built, the Blessed Holy One crowned himself with the crown, and the king sat with the bride. And ever since the temple was destroyed, the Blessed Holy One has not been crowned with his crowns, because that beauty has been concealed and hidden away.
Okay.
That's quite sad, really, because he's got this beautiful picture.
Yeah.
And then it's not there for us to see.
Yeah, really good. So absolutely the emotion there is kind of the sadness of exile and what that means. What does it mean? What's the imagery here in terms of how they imagine the moment of giving the Torah, how they imagine the moment of building the temple, and how they imagine our current moment?
It's just pure joy and delight, I get the feeling. Like he's comparing it to the day of a wedding, and it's like the Torah is like when they say the bride and groom, isn't it? Don't they say that's all linked with the huppah and everything else? This is what it's explaining in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah. So they absolutely says wedding imagery, and there's coronation imagery, which often go hand in hand, right? That the moment of giving the Torah to Israel was both a wedding and a coronation, something which is a ceremony most of us will probably not be too familiar with, except in a couple of weeks we're going to be celebrating our own coronation, right? So exactly what that means is not too hard for us to understand, what that marks in that sense. So that's how they're imagining the moment of giving the Torah. And the moment when the temple was built, that's when actually they moved in, the king and the bride, right? We're using explicitly polytheistic language, the king and the queen, the prince and the bride, the groom and the bride. Notice how he capitalizes in the translation, king and bride. Rightly so, I think. This is not the monotheism we were taught about in Cheder for sure. David?
Could we? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you told already about the coronation. There is this kind of royalty things that the coronation is very sacred, the anointment is secret, and then there will be a public manifestation after that. So it's quite interesting that this so ancient concept is still modern in the monarchies.
Yeah. Yeah, Britain perhaps preserved these ideas better than most. Other David, what were you going to say?
I was going to ask, if we're to connect this with our original small paragraph about Israel being the third most powerful nation, the third superpower. Could we be talking here that when theologically, I mean, the idea would have been that Israel would have been the third most powerful nation or whatever, because, or the most respected nation out of the three, because when we had the Torah, or when it was given, when the Holy One gave us the Torah, that's how the nations would look upon us, as we were a mighty nation. However, since the temple was destroyed, we were no longer that third mighty nation. And the idea is that when we rebuild the temple in the days of Messiah, we will again become that third most powerful nation.
Yeah, I don't think it's impossible. I mean, obviously there's a reason this is here following that. We don't really see the steps, but that does make sense to some degree, that what they're really thinking about is, you know, that future time when the king and the bride sit back down once again, and all the crowns are back once again. And that not only has spiritual implications, but also has political ones, right? That will make Israel that third superpower. It's also, I mean, it's hard not to read this stuff in light of our own times, right? In which Israel is quite legitimately a superpower in some ways, especially in its local neighborhood. You know, has its own complicated history with that power. But the temple has not been rebuilt, but much of the Jewish community has returned. And you know, one of the questions is, for the people who sat down to compose this in medieval Spain, they could not have imagined that actually the day was coming when there would be a sovereign nation, a powerful one, of Jews in the land of Israel. Now that that's here, we don't really quite know what to do with it or what it means. And lots of people have interpreted its meaning in different ways. It's not hard, though, when you see this, to see how the kind of religious Zionist movement sees the political Zionism as a connection to this spiritual reinvigoration, although it might be oversimplifying facts. So Rabbi Elazar now is going to respond with something that seems to be totally different. And this is typical for Zohar, right? We've seen this over and over. They quote this verse, that verse, this verse, that verse. They don't seem connected. And then maybe if we're lucky, we can try and draw some meaning of them all together. So we've got first the bit from Isaiah about Israel being the third superpower, then this idea of Darachecha darkei noam, all of her ways are ways of pleasantness, and that's a reference to the fact that we should imagine the moment of Mount Sinai as a coronation and a wedding where the king and the bride were together, and since then they've been split up, and we're kind of dealing with this divorced parent situation. We're going from one place to the other, and we don't have the kind of unity of the family. And now Rabbi Elazar is quoting something else entirely, which is Exodus 24, right, which is describing the moment that Moses goes into the cloud. And the language is strange of going into the cloud that's atop Mount Sinai, and that's going to cause them to draw some whole significant storytelling from that strange language. Someone else want to pick up? We've got plenty of readers, so I want to make sure everyone gets a turn if they'd like.
I'll do it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Paula.
Rabbi Elazar said, when Moses, our teacher, entered the cloud, as is written, Moses entered the cloud, Exodus, like a person moving in a realm of spirit. He encountered a magnificent angel. It has been taught that his name is Kemuel, appointed over 12,000 ordained messengers. He sought to attack Moses. Moses opened with 12 engraved letters of the holy name taught to him by the blessed Holy One at the bush. And he distanced himself 12,000 parasangs from him.
Okay, so this is not the story that's in the book of Exodus, right, about what happens when Moses goes up on the mountain. Nothing is described to us about what happens behind the scenes. Here we have a suddenly very rich and kind of folkloric description of what happens. Moses goes in and is immediately threatened. So the angels, this is a common theme in a lot of Midrashim, that the angels are out to get humans. The angels are jealous of humans. The angels resent humans. The angels don't like humans. And they're always trying to kind of prove to God that humans were a waste of time. So Moses goes into the cloud, and this angel named Kemuel is there, who is magnificent. Doesn't tell us what that means exactly. But Moses is able to stop him. How does Moses stop him? How does he defend himself?
With 12 letters.
The letters.
Tribes.
Yeah, so he's got 12 letters of the holy name. There's a variety of different ways to construct these different names of God. Whether this is 12 of the 72 or whether this is a different 12, doesn't really matter for the story. But Moses has this powerful, magical name. This is a common theme in these stories. And Moses, in particular, but anyone especially, can use the language of God's names in order to do magic. They are spells. And this was taught to him by God at the burning bush. The Zohar elsewhere, when it talks about the burning bush, imagines that Moses was there for a whole week. It's not usually how we imagine it, right? That actually Moses spent a whole week camped out at the burning bush, arguing with God about whether or not he should go and do the mission. And it took a week for God to convince him that he should go and do the mission. And that in that week, a lot more stuff happened than we read about. And one of those things, evidently, was that God taught Moses a secret name that he could use to protect himself, kind of fail-safe. So he uses the name, and he flies somehow 12,000 parasangs. So a parasang in the ancient Greek world, borrowed from Persian measurements, is 3.5 miles, thereabouts. So, I'm not a math person, but, that's 40,000 miles or so. He flies through the cloud 40,000 miles. That's a long way.
Is that approximately the circumference of the world? Like, basically, maybe he moved the entire way around the world and back to where he started.
Yeah. That's like almost like a cartoon, like Saturday morning cartoon version. Goes all the way around.
Like Superman.
What's that?
Like Superman.
Yes, right. So I don't think it's wrong to imagine that perhaps this is kind of, it's more than the circumference of the world, evidently. The circumference is about 25,000 miles. So he went around and then some.
Perhaps he went upwards, though. Perhaps he didn't go around.
Yeah, so where did he go? It doesn't, but the whole idea of space that's being constructed inside the cloud, it's almost a kind of another dimension is how we might phrase it. And they try and draw attention to that by using these absurdly large numbers, like with like 12,000 parasangs. Also notice significance of 12, right? Himuel is appointed over 12,000 angels. Moses has a 12-lettered name that he uses to protect himself. And then he flies forward 12,000 parasangs. So there's a kind of lovely coincidence of the numerical significance of 12 here. Okay.
Yeah.
Should we see what happens next, Paula?
Yeah. Moses walked on through the cloud, his eyes flaming like coals of fire, until he encountered an angel, more grand and honored than the first. It has been taught that his name is Hadradaniel. Is that right? Hadradaniel. And he's 1,060 myriads of parasangs above other angels. His voice traverses 200,000 heavens encircled by white fire. As soon as Moses saw him, he could not speak. He wanted to throw himself out of the cloud. The blessed Holy One said to him, Moses, are you not the one who spoke at length with me at the bush for 3 days and sought to know the secret of the holy name, and did not fear, and now you are afraid of one of my attendants?
Okay. Love this, right? So Moses passes trial number 1, which was Kemuel. Now he's walking on, his eyes shooting laser beams. This is my translation. Although I think flaming like coals of fire is not so different, right? To the Superman analogy, he's not only flying through the air, but shooting fire out of his eyes. And he encounters another angel, very kind of classic folklore type story. Angel number 2, named Hadraniel. I like the little note that we've been taught his name is Hadraniel. Like, we're not really sure. And Hadraniel is 1,060, very precise number, myriads. A myriad is 10,000 of parasangs above their angels. So if you do the math on that, which I think I've done correctly, it's 37 million miles as a distance measurement, 37.1 million miles above other angels. Right, so we're talking astronomical measurements here. 37 million miles is halfway to the sun practically. It's 93 million miles from here. So when he talks about going this kind of distance, I'm not sure what we're meant to imagine, but it's not just the distance in terms of how people are moving. It's also the angel's voice. Hadraniel's voice traverses 200,000 heavens encircled with white fire. It's hard not to imagine that, again, astronomically. 200,000 galaxies, white fire sounds like what you see when you look at the Milky Way. I don't know. What do you think?
Extraterrestrials.
What's that, Paula?
Extraterrestrials.
Yeah, it definitely feels a little bit extraterrestrial, right? They don't talk about in the sense of planets and stars, but they do talk about such big distances. It's astronomical numbers.
Well, maybe the distance he was above the heavens are different realms.
Could be.
But also, I think the angel are the hierarchy, so who knows what is his ranks? So, and if it's this a parallel dimension into the cloud itself, so we don't know actually who is this angel, or because it just said that it's an angel.
Yeah.
Isn't it just that it's so huge, like in the tinderbox, the eyes as big as soup plates, eyes as big as, everything has a bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
Just to say that the obstacle and the fear and the what Moses has to traverse is gigantic. I think, isn't it just giving? They're not real measurements, are they?
Yeah. I don't think we should take it too literally, partially because these guys weren't astronomers. And partially because I do think it serves storytelling purpose of kind of, gajillions, this kind of made up notion of immensity. But that said, for that being the case, they're awfully specific with the numbers, which doesn't really, if they just want to say a lot, there's a lot of ways they could say a lot without saying 1,060 myriads of parasangs.
Perhaps it's wrong to try and put anything physical against this, because this must be in the spirit realm or of something like that, where there are no words in our language to describe such angels and God. So this is their attempt to kind of give this mind-blowing enormity to it all, I suppose.
Definitely something kind of psychedelic about it, in that the experience is impossible to describe with language, but they're doing their best by using exaggerated, dramatic language. Regardless of the size, it's Moses' emotion that we really center on, which is Moses gets really scared. So scared he wants to throw himself out of the cloud, right? He's just going to jump and hope for the best. He's 37 million miles away or whatever. And he doesn't, partially because God tells him off. And what does God say to him?
Basically, say, you have been so intimate with me that you're now scared of me, but you're scared of my creation. So it's quite interesting.
Right, which is lovely. And I definitely feel where that's coming from. But what Moses saw when Moses saw God was a little bush in the desert that happened to be on fire and didn't go out. It's, kind of not the same as an angel whose voice traverses 200,000 heavens circled by white fire. I feel like, God's kind of gaslighting Moses here. Because obviously what Moses is afraid of is the appearance of what he's seeing. He's afraid of the immensity of it, not necessarily of the particular being. Interestingly, that God doesn't manifest in these dramatic languages, only the angels. But nonetheless, Moses is told off. You weren't afraid of me. No reason you should be afraid of these guys. And it works, right? Let's go on a little bit further and see that it works. Paul, do you want to read one more for us?
Yeah. When Moses heard the voice of the obsessed Holy One, he was strengthened. He opened his mouth, and the 22 letters of the supernal name, as soon as Handriel heard the letters of the holy name from the mouth of Moses, he trembled. He approached him and said, "Happy is your share, son of a moral, for you has been revealed what has not been revealed to supernal angels."
Okay, so God gives Moses a little bit of a, don't worry, you'll be all right. Moses responds once more by using human language and using now the 72 letters of the name. He used a 12-letter one before, and now he's got the full 72-letter name. He pronounces it, And this makes the angel, Hadraniel, cower, right? Once he hears the letters come out of Moses' mouth, the angel is trembling. He's made this giant, terrifying angel who's got 200,000 heavens that his voice traverses, circled by white fire, scared because he's correctly read out the 72-letter name of God. Not only is he scared, he's now humbled. The angel comes to Moses and says, lucky are you, right? Happy are you, son of a mortal, for to you has been revealed what has not been revealed to supernal angels. The implication being the angels don't know God's 72-letter name, despite all the power they have and the immensity they have and all of this very impressive pyrotechnics. They don't actually know the real meaning and the real power, which is in language. Instead, that's for humans. So Moses has this incredible kind of moment of outsmarting them purely by just saying some words, despite the intense experience of being terrified of what he sees. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go on. Someone want to read next for us? Moses continuing his journey. Anyone else want to pick up from where we are now? Thank you, Paula, for reading for. Robin, do you want to pick up? We're at the top of the page.
Right. Right. Yeah. He accompanied him until he reached the fierce fire of Sandalphon. It has been taught, Sandalphon transcends his fellows by a distance of 500 years, and he stands behind the curtain of his master, weaving him crowns out of Israel's supplications of prayer. When that crown reaches the head of the holy king, he accepts the prayer of Israel, and all the powers and legions tremble and shout, blessed is the glory of Adonai from the dwelling of his presence.
Okay, so who's our next baddie on Moses' way through?
Sandalphon.
Sandalphon, right? Again, a lovely Greek name for a Jewish angel. And Sandalphon, interestingly, is even bigger, seems to be the implication, but now they're using as a measurement for distance time, which is incredibly far-sighted of them, as that's how we now measure immense distances in our own world, right? When we use the phrase light years, what we're measuring is a distance, but we call it a year because it's a distance that light covers in a year. So it's not clear that they have exactly the same notion of these huge astronomical scales, but it might be that when they say that Sandalphon is actually, he passes his compatriots by 500 years, what they mean is something like what we say by light years, which is huge, right? Way bigger than the 37 million miles. A light year is, I don't know, does anyone know how many millions of miles a light year is?
No.
So we can compare. 1 light year in miles is, thanks Google, it is 5.879 times 10 to the 12 miles. So that's a lot of zeros after nearly 6 trillion billion miles or something. That's 1 year. This is 500 years. Again, don't know if they really mean light years, but if they mean something even like that, we get a sense of the scale. And we're now talking at the galactic scale, if that's the case. And Sandalphon, as a result, is even scarier. He has a very important job, which he stands directly behind the curtain where God sits. Again, what that means, not clear. And he takes all the prayers that Israel makes and weaves the prayers into a crown. It's a lovely image. And when that crown gets put onto God's head, that's when he accepts all the prayers of Israel, which is a beautiful, troubling, strange, kind of very dramatic image. David and then Jason?
I just don't remember if Sandalphon actually, it's Elijah translated, well, when he went to, into the sky. And then it's very interesting that the responses came from the Kedusha, that it's supposed to be by the angel, but the other prayers of the human. So I found really interesting the figure of Sandalphon, that it's really have multiple layers anyway. So I think that if I remember well, it was Elijah when he went to the sky in one of the version.
Yeah. So
do you know anything about that?
You're right. That one of the versions of who Sandalphon is, which is a Greek name, one of the versions of who Sandalphon is that it is Elijah turned into an angel. Elijah would have been the second person who the tradition believes got turned from a human into an angel. The other one was Hanoch, Enoch, who curiously disappears in the book of Genesis, just as he went away without dying, and that caused the whole tradition of the idea that he got turned into an angel. He also, if he did get turned into an angel, is given a Greek name as well, which is Metatron. And so if that's the case, then you have these two formerly humans, now angels, Metatron and Sandalphon, who both have Greek names and have a very high status in this kind of angelic hierarchy. Most of us never come across this stuff in Jewish texts, but it's definitely there, right? This angelology. It seems very strange to us, but it's clearly part of the Midrashic tradition, at least, to imagine all these stories of the angels. Jason, you had your hand up, I think. Then you disappeared.
I kind of like the sciencey bit with time and space. And I'm just wondering if they're trying to set up this kind of idea of multi-dimensional beings a bit more.
It's not impossible. I don't want to read too much into it and say, oh yeah, they understand contemporary astronomical units. But I don't think it's impossible that they have a sense that when you get to such a big scale, you're actually not measuring in typical space, but rather in terms of how much space is covered in time. It'd be really interesting to see if there's other places where this comes up, because I haven't seen this before where it talks about years as a measure of size. And if it's a consistent thing, maybe you get a better sense of actually whether this was something they understood or whether it was just a one-off. But it is, I also feel quite drawn to it in the sense of, maybe they do have some sense here of dimensions. They do talk about different worlds and angels existing in several worlds at once. And of course, we have this idea that Hadraniel's voice covers 200,000 worlds or heavens. So there's a real deep sense of just complexity to this cosmic realm, which is hard for us to really conceive of. Okay, so we're up to Sandalphon. Moses once again is scared. He's now, by the way, it's turned into a buddy cop movie. He's now got Hadraniel, who he outsmarted with the 72-letter name, with him. And they're now together going to approach Sandalphon, or attempt to. So let's see what happens, Robin.
Hadraniel said to Moses, Moses, I cannot proceed with you, lest the fire of Sandalphon burn me. At that moment, Moses trembled until the Blessed Holy One grasped him, seated him before him, and taught him Torah. He covered Moses with the light and radiance of that beauty, and Moses' face shone through all the heavens. All powers of heaven trembled before him when he descended with the Torah. Okay,
so we have just an incredible image here of what happened, right? So Moses is coming up to the last obstacle. Hadraniel, his angel BFF, now says, sorry, can't go with you any further. This is where I get off. And Sandalphon is too much for him. God steps in, grabs him, sits him down in front of him, and they start learning Torah. Classic rabbi imagining of the cosmic fantasy. They learn some Torah, and as they're learning Torah, right, as Moses is receiving the Torah, all of the powers of heaven are trembling before him, and the radiance of Moses' face shone. This is, of course, a reference to what it describes when Moses comes down and he has to wear a veil because there's light coming out of his face. This is a way of explaining why that is, how that came about, is because of this kind of extreme encounter with the cosmic realm. But it doesn't last. It doesn't last. As usual, we have a downturn very quickly after the climax of emotional intensity here. So what happens next, Robin? We know the story, don't we?
As soon as they sinned below, the Blessed Holy One took away from Moses 1,000 parts of that radiance. At that moment, supernal angels and all those legions sought to burn Moses. When the Blessed Holy One said to him, go, get down, for your people has acted corruptly. Exodus. Moses trembled and could not speak, until finally he multiplied prayers and supplications before the Blessed Holy One.
Okay, so the sin, of course, is the golden calf is going on while Moses is up there, right? As soon as it happens, God punishes Moses by taking away some of that light that was shining from his face. This whole momentary window into, oh, everyone respects Moses, all the angels are good with Moses now. As soon as the protective light gets taken away, or at least a good chunk of it, we don't know how many, but 1,000 parts out of how many, we don't know. As soon as that gets taken away, Moses is vulnerable. He's weak. And the second that he's weak, the angels try and destroy him, right? They immediately all turn on him and try and destroy him, which of course, again, is an explanation for why in Exodus 32, Moses says, go, get down, right? Like rushing Moses out of, God was rushing Moses out of the cloud. And Moses, of course, is instead praying and trying to save himself, worried, trembling. There's a recurrent theme here of Moses trembling and unable to speak. Okay. So let's see what happens next. Spoilers, Moses survives. Someone else want to pick up? Thank you, Robin, for reading from the bottom of the page. He said to him. David, Jason.
Yeah.
Lorraine.
Yeah,
Jason.
okay.
Yeah, go on.
He said to him, Moses, grasp my throne. Finally, the Blessed Holy One rebuked all those powers, and Moses grasped the 2 tablets of stone and brought them down. This is what is written. A wise man went up to the city of the mighty and brought down the strength of its trust. From that radiance remaining in him, Moses's face sparkled. Now, if with this one remaining so, they could not gaze at his face, then with the one withdrawn from him, all the more so.
Right. Incredible finale to the story here, right? Moses is protected by God. You know the old game of tag, right? Someone's got to be base. So God's throne is base, it seems. That's where you're safe. And Moses is holding onto the throne to be protected just long enough to get the 2 tablets and to get shuffled out of the cloud, whatever that dimension is. And he comes down and his face is still lit up, but only a little bit, only 1/1000th of what it should have been. And of course, that leads them to say, well, if the people couldn't stand looking at it when it was so limited, only 1/1000th, imagine what it would have been like if he hadn't lost all the other light. Also, just to point out this incredible verse from Proverbs, all right, the Proverbs verse has nothing to do with Moses. It's a proverb. A wise man went up to the city of the mighty and brought down the strength of its trust. But the city of the mighty and the language there is a reference to a polytheistic culture in which there is a city of gods in the clouds, right? And so this being applied to Moses almost makes him a kind of Promethean figure, where he went up, he braved the angels, he deftly navigated his way through all of these obstacles. He's a kind of Greco-Roman hero, right? Who went up, got the knowledge, brought it back down, and as a result was able to give everyone the Torah. It's very much like a Prometheus story, except with instead of fire, it's Torah. So Torah is a very powerful thing because it's more or less something Moses smuggled out of the cloud with God's help and his own cleverness. Okay, so Rabbi Chia now picks up the thread of his teaching again after giving us this lovely midrashic story about the cloud.
Rabbi Chia said, your right hand, O God, glorious in power, Torah, your right hand, O God, smashes the enemy. For nothing in the world breaks the power of other nations except when Israel is occupied with Torah. For whenever Israel is occupied with Torah, the power and strength of the enemies of Israel are broken. Therefore, Torah is called strength. As is said, God gives strength to his people.
Okay, so lovely combination of verses. Sentiment is Torah is power. We know that because that's what protected Moses. That's what Moses brought down for us. It's also political power, that when the nation of Israel is occupied with Torah, that's what breaks the power of the other nations. We're starting to see, as David suggested earlier, the connection back to the Isaiah verse about how Israel becomes a superpower and what the strength is that animates them in that. The strength is quite literally Torah, right? They even reread this verse from Psalms, which we sing frequently. God gives strength to his people in the present tense, as strength is clearly a metonym for Torah. God gives Torah to his people, and that is strength. Okay, so if we want to be powerful, we got to learn Torah, just like Moses. You can see how the connections are being made here. You're on mute, Jason. Sorry, I can see you're speaking, but I can't hear you.
It's just things happening around me. It's okay.
Should we carry on?
Okay. Do you want me to carry on?
Yeah, let's do one more.
All right. So I've lost my.
When Israel is not occupied with Torah.
When Israel is not occupied with Torah, the power of other nations is fortified, and they rule over them and issue unbearable decrees against them. Because of this, Israel is exiled and scattered among the nations, as is written. Why is the land ruined? God said, because they have forsaken my Torah. For whenever Israel engages in Torah, the power and strength of all nations is broken, as is written, your right hand, O God, smashes the enemy.
Okay, so we've now reached the fulfillment, the end of Rabbi Chia's whole teaching here. So let's just go back and understand where he started, because rabbis have a tendency to drift, right? They've come to this whole meeting, had a conversation about the superpowers of the world. They had this idea of Noam and Tiferet and beauty and how those are the things that matter. And then Rabbi Chia goes on this whole long thing about actually how when the Torah was given, it was like a wedding, like a coronation. It gave kind of power and significance to the Israelite kingdom. But once the Israelites were expelled, then that all fell apart. And since then, we have had this long story about Moses in the cloud, the power that he gets from going up to get Torah, literally superpower, superhero energy. He comes down, he gives that power to us. And as a result, if we use the power that Moses brought down in this Promethean fashion from the cloud, then we're able to ensure that our nation is secure. But if we don't occupy with it, if we ignore Torah, then the power of other nations is fortified and they rule over us and issue decrees against us, and we're scattered among the nations. Again, you can easily see how this leads to quite an extreme interpretation of kind of modern religious Zionism, right? And even, by the way, the arguments that are often made in terms of Haredi students being drafted into the IDF, they say, well, we don't need to fight in the IDF because we're protecting the nation by studying Torah. That's the real power, right? And they could absolutely point to this and go, look what it says here. It says the only power that really matters, the only thing that really protects us is us studying Torah. So leave us alone. Let us study Torah. And it's hard to argue with that with a text like this, because that's exactly what it seems to say. Okay.
Can you have a wider interpretation as well as just studying Torah, about that study and kind of a kind of path of righteousness is what leads to a better future for Israel than other futures. So not
absolutely,
not just holy people, but
absolutely. And I think part of the problem with the way in which this is read is that they read it as studying Torah means sitting in the Beit Midrash arguing about Gemara, as opposed to studying Torah means learning a life that is based on the values of Torah, learning to live that out, being righteous, right? When Jeremiah, notably they quoted Jeremiah, right? Why is the land ruined? Because they've forsaken my Torah. Jeremiah doesn't really mean that people aren't as frum about the chumrah of kitnios anymore. Jeremiah means people are being awful to each other. People are abusing each other. People are depriving each other. People are cheating each other. That's what bothers Jeremiah. So when he says the people have forsaken my Torah, he's focused more on what we would call the moral side of it, as opposed to the ritual side of it. So you've got to be careful to understand that context and not just take it as, oh, we just have to do more mitzvot and then everything will be fine. That's not really how I think it's meant to be read, but obviously I would say that. Robin?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of linked to that is the sort of juxtaposition of the beauty stuff at the beginning and the strength and power. And it's a sort of, it's not a it's or it might manifest itself in destructiveness eventually, but there's this sort of benevolent side of it, of the power that link, because it comes initially from that delightfulness and beauty.
Right. It's also defensive, right? This isn't how do you defeat your enemies and take over more land? You use Torah. No, it's if you want to protect yourself, if you want to make sure that no one's moving over you, you use Torah. So yeah, it's a very different image of masculinity, of warfare, of political power, of how one gains it than we might imagine. It's certainly different than what other cultures around in the same time and place would have been talking about. And there's lots to say, I think, about the way in which they construct the idea of power here, which is, couldn't be more different than the way that Rome, for instance, constructs its idea of power, amongst who the authors of this would have lived.
Is there just to think, following that through a bit as well, is there something about the sort of sense of unity and binding of all living by the Torah that gives strength, and a nation that doesn't have that unity is just not as strong?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely way to understand it. Is actually, it's not like Torah is magic, although the whole story about Moses and the cloud might imply that Torah is magic. But if you want to read it in a more practical sense, you could say that, well, when all of Israel is occupied with Torah and on the same page and having similar values, that's where the power really comes from. When you have a cohesive nation that has similar goals, that's what makes a superpower. If you think about the times in which certain countries have been dominating the world scene for whatever reason, it's because they had a real sense of purpose. Whether that's the Soviet Union or ancient Rome or contemporary China, right? They know what they're doing. They have a purpose. Everyone more or less on the same page. That's what leads to a certain amount of cohesiveness and power, and that's totally reasonable. Yeah, David.
I was thinking that when it's been written this Zohar, Israel was not anymore a kingdom, so they were needed to thinking about a sort of glorious return and a sort of responsibilities as well, how to get it. So I think it's very, very pressionistic ante litteram here.
Yeah, absolutely. The context does matter. Right, there's just a tiny bit more. Let's just read and then we'll finish up. So Rabbi Elazar has been listening this whole time, and who, remember, Rabbi Chia went to find, and finally responds to all of this and says, certainly so. So he agrees. And whenever the voice of Israel is heard in synagogues and houses of study, as we have learned, the voice is the voice of Jacob. And if not, the hands are the hands of Esav, as we have established. An incredibly interesting way for him to conclude that, right? Which is he taking this verse from Genesis, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esav, and saying, oh yes, well, that's one or the other. It's not an and, but a but. That when Israel does things right, when everyone's studying Torah and learning together and on the same page and has the same vision, then the voice is the voice of Jacob, meaning everyone speaks with that one voice. But when they're not, then the hands are the hands of Esav, meaning how they act in the world is bad, right? Esav is evil, of course, unfairly characterized as demonic and evil by the Zohar. So there's a real sense of this being the primary way of understanding what we might call soft power in a contemporary sense, right? That there's a power in cohesiveness, in Torah, in learning, in knowledge, in wisdom, in pleasantness and beauty. And the Zohar is endorsing not the way that we should get back our power is by taking up arms and defeating everyone and becoming warlike, but instead by learning more Torah. And the proof of this, of course, is Moses and the story of him defeating the angels in the cloud. And also it connects, I do think, inevitably, although we're missing that key part, it connects back to that key bit of Isaiah that was quoted at the very beginning of this passage. And the statement, how foolish are the inhabitants of the world who do not know or consider the words of Torah. For the words of Torah, ... And we can probably fill in the gap to some degree, right? That maybe what it means is how foolish it is that people read this Isaiah verse. In that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on earth, whom God will bless, saying, blessed be my people, Egypt, my handiwork, Assyria, and my heritage, Israel. How foolish it would be if we read that and thought what that means is that we need to be powerful like Egypt and Assyria are, right? How foolish it would be to read that in a literal sense, perhaps, is what's being implied here. Instead, our power is different than theirs and comes from a different source and comes in a different way and comes from an attempt to try and attain beauty and harmony and national unity, as opposed to what Egypt and Assyria did in order to gain their power. We can't really know, but it does seem like all of these things connect together into what's actually a really interesting window into this discussion among these rabbis. Any final thoughts from anyone before we go about this, especially as we think about contemporary difficulties in Israel or Pesach, and what it means to be free and to gain power again?
I am thinking that the always unanswered question, how we can be the Jewish people on the same page, is very, very, utopistical and mythological, as the Sanhedrin doesn't exist. I don't wish that return back, but I think it's very, very difficult to think about the unity as holder of a power that it will be encompassing, just not the national sovereignty. And so it's very, very tricky to thinking about, I think.
That's the 37 million mile question we might come on. It's one thing to say how nice it'd be for everyone to be on the same page. It's another thing to imagine that actually being possible, because never once, not once, never in Jewish history has everyone been on the same page or been cohesive or united.
I think this is really interesting. A couple of, either last time or the time before, we were talking a lot about leadership from a passage in the Zohar. And I just find it really interesting that the whole thing about leadership, power, and about the people, it's an angle of it that I hadn't really thought about before, about religion, about the sorts of how to maximize the potential or whatever it is of the nation in the sense of the Jewish nation. There's a lot of sort of dynamics of that I hadn't thought about much before. In this text.
Yeah, and if more people thought more about it, I think everyone would be a bit better off, to be honest.
Yeah.
Not there's a right answer, but it's worth thinking about, actually, that this whole project of the Israelite people that started with Pesach, started with the Exodus, it's messy and complicated, and it's quite unlike any other nation. And what that gives us and what we can do with that, and where the power comes from in that is actually really important to think about, because when we don't, we tend to do it poorly. And I think that's that last statement there is, when we do it right, then the voice is the voice of Jacob. When we do it wrong, the hands are the hands of Esau. And that's the danger, is that we end up being just like Egypt and Assyria in the worst possible way. So it's a very live question. And I think an interesting topic, especially thinking about Pesach and what it means to be powerless and then to be free and to gain power and what that means for us today. And I hope that everyone has an enjoyable, liberating, powerful end of Pesach. And I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you.
Very much.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.